can totally do that. I'm Alena Skinner, your host. This is the podcast where we explore careers and opportunities for people with disabilities from the perspective of people with disabilities. Today I would like to introduce to you Mason Shrader, who is a PhD student in archaeology at Brown University. Welcome, Mason.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Mason, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head. I'm a PhD student in archaeology at Brown University. My family is originally from Mississippi, so I'm a second year at Brown, and so living in New England is a bit of a cultural shock for me, but so I come from there. I don't know, like a lot of PhD students, I'm a bit of a nerd, so I play Dungeons and Dragons in my free time, and like to read a lot, so.
That's awesome. How did you get interested in your career choice?
Yeah, so it was, I think a lot of archaeologists sort of have similar answers, and that, you see Indiana Jones and all these various pop culture portrayals of archaeologists and think that looks cool, and I certainly was one of those. My family's a big fan of the Indiana Jones movies, but I also, I was kind of one of those weird kids as a child who would like to hang out around cemeteries, and I still do this. I was doing this yesterday actually. I found a cemetery in Quebec where we are right now, and I like to read tombstones and sort of glean the past from that material remnant, and so when I learned in undergrad that you could make a career out of hanging around in cemeteries, which is sort of what I specialize in archaeology now, I got really excited, and I said, well, that's what I would like to do. So.
That's amazing. Where did you go to undergrad?
Millsaps College in Mississippi. It's a small liberal arts school. And when I say small, I mean 800 people total.
Okay.
So I know many high schools that are orders of magnitude bigger than my college. But it was kind of the perfect experience for me. I got really close with my professors, and we had a really great archaeology program. I actually went to the school because of their archaeology program, which is sort of rare. Usually people kind of find archaeology as they're exploring in college, but I had kind of done all that exploration a little bit beforehand, and so I went there for that. Yeah.
That's great. And that's super cool that you like to hang around tombstones. I like the history of it, but they sometimes creep me out a little.
Sure, yeah.
When did you realize the moment of, I can totally do that?
Yeah, so this was so as I say, when I was thinking of careers to pursue, one of my dad's best friends in college is an archaeologist. Just sort of by happenstance. And so I had always kind of known that was a thing. And so it really wasn't, it didn't really ever cross my mind that I couldn't do that, until I started getting further into the field. So when I sort of picked archaeology as a career, there was always a sense of I can do that. And then when I started applying to what we call field schools, which are the sort of methods classes for archaeology that you have to take, you had to go out into an excavation and actually learn how to excavate. When I started applying for those in undergrad, I kept getting rejections back, and this sort of rare. Field schools, it's not like college or grad school, where it's a real application process. The application is usually a bit of a formality. And so rejection is rare, but I kept getting rejected. And the reason that was because they said, your disability would be what they said as a liability, which meant that if I got hurt on the dig, they assumed I would get hurt because I was disabled, and thus that would be a legal problem for the dig. And so it was, it was interesting. I spent a lot of my early days thinking about archaeology without any concept of not being able to do that. I automatically thought I could do it, and then as I got further into the field, I realized that not a lot of other people shared my confidence, right? But that first round of field school applications, I eventually went to a school with my professor at Millsaps, and he's a Mayanist. And I don't work in the Maya world. I'm a Mediterranean archaeologist, and so I was applied to Mediterranean programs. But he was like, why don't you just come with me for the first time? I know it's not your thing, but you'll get experience. And when we decided to do that, he sat me down and said, okay, I want you to tell me what you can and cannot do, what you are not comfortable doing on a dig, and we can work out exactly the kind of role you'll have in this excavation. And that was the moment for me where I realized, because I was starting to think that maybe archaeology wasn't for me when I was getting all these rejections, and that was the moment when he sat me down and said that. And I said, okay, there is a path for me. I just gotta work with people who also believe that. And so, yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool that you have been involved in trying to work in archaeology, but it's so frustrating that society takes what they think you have and turns it into a legal matter. And
Yeah.
I'm so glad that your professor kind of was like, well, let's get started on a path somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, to be clear, I think it's important to say for your listeners that, it wasn't really a legal matter, right? I've never gotten hurt on a dig. I know other people, able-bodied people, who have gotten hurt. I haven't. I think oftentimes, disabled people are much more aware, physically disabled people are much more aware of our bodies than able-bodied people are, right? Because we have to be. And so I think I'm much more careful. Just statistically, I know I'm much more careful on digs than my peers because I haven't gotten hurt. And so I've been on 11 digs now in my career, and none of them I've gotten hurt on, and that's, so in fact, I was less of a legal liability than some of the able-bodied students I've worked with.
I'm so glad that you have not gotten hurt, but then that you can kind of prove it to society.
Yeah, exactly.
And I totally agree with being more physically aware. Tell me, why do you feel it's important to have people with disabilities in your career?
Oh, very cool question. So I actually published. It's in press right now. I'm publishing an academic article about this very thing. So if it comes up at the time this podcast comes out, I'll send it to you and you can link it. But I think one of the reasons I think it's important is, and this is the argument I take in the chapter, me and my co-author take, is that it's sort of a matter of ethics, right? I think archaeology, like every academic field, should not limit itself to some inherent fact about an individual, right? That is ethically known as discrimination. And so there's an ethics component to this that I think is obviously important, but I think there's also a knowledge component. So I study how disability exists in the ancient Mediterranean, right? And so, and this is a relatively new thing to study. It's been only about 10 years old, but thus far the only people studying it are able-bodied individuals, right? And as I'm sure you know, Alena, when able-bodied people talk about disability, no matter how knowledgeable they are, there's something a little bit different than how we disabled people talk about it. There's something experientially missing, right? And so I think when we talk about archaeology, we talk about sort of illuminating the past to the greatest detail possible. And I think that detail of like how does disability actually work in an embodied experiential sense, that detail in the past is sort of missing when you don't have disabled people thinking about this. So I think I can add new insight into our knowledge of the past precisely because I'm disabled, and that's a whole nother component to this.
I totally agree with that, and I think that's a great career choice for you as you choose to shed some light on your basically on your everyday life.
Yeah.
Whether it had changed 100 years ago but there's always something just a little bit different. Some everyday things that we just don't always share, but we do every day.
Exactly.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you do in your everyday career?
Yeah, so my sort of everyday career is a bit boring, like most grad students, no matter what your field is. You spend the majority of the year, and this is no different for me, at a university setting. So I'm still in the stage of my PhD where I go to classes. This will be done in about a year and a half, and then I'll be a candidate and just working on my dissertation and just writing that. But right now I'm going to classes and I teach. And so teaching is really fun for me. Teaching is largely why I'm an academic, just probably because I knew I loved archaeology, but there are other ways to do archaeology that aren't just academia. But the reason I like being in academia is because I like to teach. I like to talk, which is probably not surprising to anyone at this point. But I teach a class Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I hold office hours for my students, and then in between those times, I take graduate classes of my own. So I take classes on my time period, my specialty. I take classes in an osteology lab because I'm what's called a bioarchaeologist, which means I specialize in ancient bones, which is why I spend so much time in cemeteries. And so I have a class in that, and then I'm also taking modern Greek because I work in Greece, so I had to learn to speak the local language, and I am very bad at it, but I do work hard at not being so yeah, it's a lot of school, a lot of teaching, and I try to take some Saturday off once in a while, but that's about it. So
that's cool. In terms of when you teach, do you feel that the students are okay or don't judge you for having it? Like, is there some unkept
bias,
yes,
ableism?
Yeah.
It depends. So I have 2 masters, and now I'm getting my PhD. Where I got the 2 masters was at a state school in Texas called Texas Tech University. And there I did, a state school, you get a wide swath of individuals, right? It's in some ways it's the most accessible way to go to college, whether for socioeconomic reasons and things like this. And so you get sort of the widest array of students, and there I did face some moments. I heard some students call me the R word and things like this. At first, they would see me as a TA and whisper, things. But then when I got up to teach, I think usually that goes away, because I don't think you can hold that sort of bias for long if you're actually engaging with what I say. And indeed, I met so many students after I taught then at Tech who I forgot. I mean, I was teaching 200-person classes, right? So I did not know every student there. They would come up to me for years after and say, just in restaurants and things, and say, hey, definitely don't remember me, but I'm so-and-so, I was in your class. I just wanted to say you specifically made a huge impact on me. And so it is a matter of, like, that does happen occasionally, but I don't think it sticks around usually. At Brown now, Brown is very, like, all the students are very crunchy and very sort of hippie, and they don't, I haven't gotten any of that from my Brown students, really. They are maybe a little bit unsure of me as a TA because I'm a TA, and it's sort of weird in between a student and a professor, but I've gotten no such pushback yet. But it's early days. I'm in my second year, so I've only been teaching for essentially a semester at Brown, because we're on fellowship for first year. So I'll get back to you on that. But thus far, I have not experienced any sort of ableism there.
Well, I'm glad to hear it, and I'm glad to hear that the things can change when you do experience it. What is your biggest accomplishment been in your career?
Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, I'm very proud of, as I say, this ethics article I published. It's my first publication, which is a big deal in academia. We say publish or perish, right? You have to publish things or else you don't get jobs. So that means a lot to me because it sort of bridges my career and my activism work, which I don't get to do often. But also, like, more specifically archaeologically related, I've been a part of so many cool excavations. Was my very first cemetery I ever dug up was a part of this sort of a 4th century Roman necropolis, 4th century CE, so late Roman necropolis in Spain. And while everyone else was digging sort of we were digging burials, right? It's a necropolis, a Roman word for a cemetery, in Latin. I was digging my grave, and everyone else was finding what you usually find in archaeology of skeletons. You find a couple of carpals here, a couple of tarsals there, some ribs maybe, but not whole skeletons. And I started opening up my grave, and there was one skull staring back up at me. And then I started digging more, and there was another skull looking back up at me, and I started digging more, and there was another one. And then I sort of moved kind of distally down what I thought was the skeleton. And all 3 skeletons were completely preserved. And this was my first ever skeletal excavation. And so I think to be a part of that sort of data collection process in a way that is like so unique that it sort of in some ways set my expectations too high, but I am still sort of proud at that moment because it has nothing to do with like my prowess as an archaeologist or anything. It has everything to do with luck, but archaeology is like 90% luck anyway. So that's a moment that I still think back to, and it's like when I think, why am I doing this? I think of that moment of like a human being staring back up at you from 2,000 years ago, or 1,600 years ago, And that it's a powerful moment, right? And I had 3 of them doing that, so.
That's so cool, and I'm sure that kind of fed your fire to continue to go. Now, what has been your greatest disappointment?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this one. It's a great question. I think so. I talked about how early in my career as an undergrad, right? I struggled, sort of finding a field school because of my disability. I think my greatest disappointment is that that continues, in different ways. People don't nowadays. I'm at this very sort of good program, internationally known program for archaeology at Brown. And Brown itself, even outside of archaeology, is very famous, right? And so that is a certain clout that, like, people don't turn me down for things because of that anymore. So that specific thing doesn't happen. But I'm now dealing with a different type of ableism of, like, when I present at conferences and things like that, or when I talk to people about my work, they sort of say things like, well, you're just projecting this onto the past because you're disabled. Disabled people really didn't exist back then. You're just imagining it because you are disabled. And this is demonstrably untrue. I mean, my work empirically can demonstrate that this is not true. But people still want to hold on to that, right? And so there's that sort of bias happening. And then there's the, like, weird other side of that coin, which I think is the same phenomenon, but in a different manifestation, which is people really want me to be. I'm one of the few disabled people working on this. There's like maybe 5 of us in the world, and I'm, as far as I know, the only one in North America, at least at the level that I'm at. And so people come to me all the time who are not, let's say, I don't want to call them ableist, but let's say not knowledgeable about disability, and they want me to be their sort of band-aid. They want to publish an article with me so that they look better about how they handle disability, or they want me to educate them about how to treat other disabled people in the field better. And I'm happy to do these things to a certain point with, like, my friends and people I actually know who are legitimately trying to do better. But there are often lots of people who just want to attach their name to a disabled person as sort of a token thing, right? Tokenism. To simply make themselves look better. And some of my sort of academic heroes, papers I've read that have inspired my work, right? People whose thought processes have changed my whole thinking have done this to me when I met them. And that is hugely disappointing, right? To meet your heroes and to think, oh, I'm no more than a token to you. I'm no more than a stepping stone to make yourself look better. Right? As I say, there's a way to do this from able-bodied professors that is nice and is sort of open-minded and selfless. My co-author in that chapter I keep talking about is able-bodied herself, and she's great. I work with her because she is not sort of selfish about this. But there are people who are out there, as I say, formerly academic heroes of mine, who want to just use my disability as a means to make them look better. And that's hugely disappointing.
Yes, that definitely hurts, and I'm sorry you experienced that. Can you tell me a little bit about, is there any part of your career that is modified to accommodate your disability?
Tons of it. I would say most of it, in fact. So, I mean, the day-to-day stuff that I mentioned for most of the year I mean, I don't think is any different than most physically disabled people, right? Like, I have to live pretty close to campus because I cannot walk that far, and when I wasn't in Providence, which is where Brad is, I was in Lubbock, Texas for my master's, and there's no way to live close to campus in Lubbock, like it's too spread out. It's like the second largest campus per acreage in the nation, only under Air Force, because the Air Force has to have like runways. And so imagine the school without runways being almost as large as the one with runways. It's a big campus, and so you couldn't live close. So I had to have a motorized scooter to get there. And these are adaptations that are crucial to my career, but as I say, probably not that unique from most disabled people going to high school or college. But I will say, the other side of my career, which is the more interesting side, which is what I do during the summer, is I'm on excavations, and I'm in labs over the summer doing research. Because as archaeologists, we're field scientists, right? So we don't have the luxury of doing what a lot of graduate students do over the summer, which is stay in libraries and work on their research. Our research is out there in the field in ancient sites, right? And so to get out there and to dig in those settings does take some pretty substantial adaptation. Right, so in my case, when I was excavating, I don't so much do it anymore because I've gotten to the point of my career where I can supervise people who excavate. But when I was excavating, I would bring knee pads with me. And this is, a lot of archaeologists do this, not just disabled archaeologists, but foam kneeling pads that I bought at Home Depot, and I lay them down, and I sort of lay them down lengthwise across my body, and then lay down on the ground and excavate that way, because kneeling is tough for me, squatting is nearly impossible for me. But I can lay down and excavate. So how I dug up those skeletons in Spain was laying down alongside the skeletons, which provides its own sort of unique problems. But I also have I bring a kind of special iPad to take notes. I have this sort of heavy duty field work case around it's an iPad mini. And so instead of taking notes in a field notebook like most archaeologists do, this is how I take notes on the iPad. And that is, when I started almost 10 years ago in undergrad, this was abnormal. But now actually most archaeologists are moving to iPads. With apps like Kiosk and iDig. There are archaeology-specific apps that are now coming out to take notes in the field. And so I kind of feel like I was a bit of a trendsetter there, but that was at one point an adaptation. What else do I do? Often, the most extreme case of an adaptation is I was working in this unit once, that I had to get lowered down into because it was multiple meters deep. And so normally people climb up and down a ladder to get down in there, and I could not. Ladders and I don't get along well. So everyone working around me was like, no problem, we'll just pass you sort of down with multiple people, and that's how you'll get down there. So archaeology is, I think, fundamentally adaptive, because so many people work on a site, right? The last true excavation I was at had 90 people working on it, of which I was just one supervisor, right? And so this notion of collaboration and accommodation is sort of baked into the premise of archaeology. And so people don't think about it often, but when I actually do get out into the field, people often realize, oh, we're just doing what we do with anybody else, and just working with what they can and cannot do. Some people can't work the screen and sift through the dirt. Some people can't dig as well, so they work the screen. Some people can't stand the heat, so they stay in the lab. We're always accommodating, and so that is sort of why I like archaeology. But yeah, those are the various, to answer your question, the various ways I do it.
That's so funny, about you getting lifted down.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I guess I never realized like how much archaeology could and should be adapted. Like, and I love your trend setting about your iPad, because I feel like I've also done a lot of that in my schooling and in other places. Kind of going along with that, how do you ask for help in a professional manner?
It's a great question, and I think it's crucial to be able to ask for help, to be able to advocate for oneself. The thing I learned in undergrad very quickly, not just in archaeological settings, but in classroom settings, and just in life, is that the easiest way to get adaptation, to get accommodation, to participate, is to ask for what you need, right? And so I think I tell this story in a lot of different venues, but I think it works well here. When I was applying to college, I toured my college, Millsaps, and this was the only school that this happened at, so it was very auspicious for me. But I was touring, and my mom did what all good disabled parents do, and was very nervous about the whole thing, and like, how is this gonna work? And she wanted to meet with everybody. She wanted to meet with the ADA office and like ask them 90 different questions, right? And she had this whole list. And so she goes and I'm touring around the thing, and she goes and she meets with this guy who's the head of the ADA office, and she has her big, essentially, scroll of questions, right? And he says, he told me this later, he would eventually become my first ever boss, so he told me this, but he said, hey, I'm gonna close your scroll here. We're gonna pause these questions, because I would actually rather hear questions from Mason. And this was like a big deal for both me and my mom, of like, this is the only person who ever really did this, and the schools we toured of like, say that part of accommodation, part of what Student Disability Services, the ADA office, or whatever, can do is like take what you need and enact it, right? But it has to be a sort of you had to be proactive about it, and so this was. So he did. When I was done with the tour, Mom came up to me and said, "I want to introduce you to this guy," and he said, "Mason, I want to ask you. I've heard a lot about your mom's concerns, but what are your concerns?" And that was really kind of my first lesson of being like, you gotta speak up. And sometimes I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Sometimes speaking up is not enough, right? So when I got to my master's program, I was thinking, so I'm a Mediterranean archaeologist, so I have to know ancient Greek and Latin, its whole thing. But I was taking a Latin class. And it was this hard, huge Latin class. And I get there the first day, and this teacher is very old-fashioned, very kind of stuck up and awkward, like a lot of classicists are. And she goes, if anyone needs accommodations, you had to meet me in my office hours. and we'll talk about it. So I said, no worries. This is what I've been doing forever. I've been doing it since undergrad. That lesson I learned served me well in undergrad. I would always self-advocate, and I never had a problem. So I was like, this is no different. So I went to the professor and I said, hey, Dr. So-and-so, I have to have a laptop in class. And I have to have a laptop during tests. And she said, well, the laptop's not going to be a problem in class, but it is 100% going to be a problem during tests. And this was the first time I had ever heard this. Every other professor I had ever had was like, yeah, no problem. We'll just if we're really concerned about people looking at your stuff, we'll just sit you in the back. It's not that big a deal. You can have a laptop. I trust you. But she did not trust me. And so she was like, we have to set you up in a private room with a private computer. You can't use your laptop. And you'll essentially be stuck in that room for however long the test takes alone to take this test. And that room was on the other side of campus. So I was, sort of literally segregated because of my sort of academic needs, right? And there was no amount of self-advocacy I could do to change this. She wasn't going to move. And so that's another thing I would say is that know that sometimes there are, I had to learn quickly in grad school that sometimes there are going to be moments of what I consider to be pretty ableist, right? And you just have to, part of navigating that is knowing that it shouldn't get you down, right? I mean, it's sort of a bleak thing to say. There will be moments where maybe it's not all just self-advocacy works all the time, but I mean, I did worse in that class than I otherwise would have because of that setup. And so I had to learn to say, don't judge myself based on this, because this was sort of an external thing that happened to me. And then I did the sort of happy end of that story was that I was able to go to the head of our department and say, listen, this is what happened. I don't feel like this is right. All the rest of the professors in this department don't treat me like this. I got a substantially lower grade than I've ever had because of this. Can you just, when you're thinking about our sort of final transcripts, can you keep that in mind? And sure enough, he did then talk to the professor, and she gave essentially the whole class a curve. So we all sort of did badly. It was a tough class. And so we all did a little bit better because of that. And so I was able to sort of advocate for myself and my classmates, frankly, outside of that setting. But it took acknowledging that, okay, this is a roadblock. I'm gonna have to accept that I'm getting nowhere with this one person, so I go to another. And that kind of unfortunate and sometimes depressing acceptance is also part of it, because you need to know who you can talk to and who you can't, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I'm glad that you kept persevering and were able to eventually get something a little bit better than you originally had. Finally, what advice would you give to somebody with a disability who wants to pursue your career?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, actually, and I'm glad to answer it because we need more archaeologists with disabilities in the world. I would say, first and foremost, that know that, that if somebody says you can't do it, there are other digs. There are always other opportunities. There are so many archaeologists in the world, right? So much data to be analyzed, right? I would also say that archaeology is so many things at once. And so maybe, like my disability doesn't let me really do survey much, which is this whole other side of archaeology where you just walk for miles on end looking for sites without digging. You just walk in a straight line on like a Greek island somewhere and hike up mountains and do all this stuff. And there are probably ways I can make that adaptive, but it seems like a lot more work than necessary. Yeah. So I would say that maybe if you're a disabled person, that there are aspects of archaeology that maybe are less accessible to your specific disability like that, but then that also means the flip side of that is that there are more accessible sides. So like these days I primarily work in a lab with a bunch of boats that has very little interaction with my disability at all, right? Like I'm sitting down at a table looking at an ancient tibia, like it doesn't really affect, my disability doesn't really affect that. And so I found a sort of specialization where it is sort of inherently more accessible. And so archaeology, like every academic, medical, whatever discipline, has versions of that, right? And so that's what I'd say, is that you can find an archaeology for your disability. It's out there. There are warehouses full of pottery remains and data that people just haven't analyzed because they keep digging up stuff. And so maybe you're struggling to excavate as a disabled person, but you could do that sort of new analysis on that unprocessed material. I could go on forever. But I would say that's my biggest piece of advice, is that if somebody tells you you can't do one thing, one, find another person to ask, and two, find another thing to do if that really turns out to be the case. Because I really don't think there is any one-size-fits-all statement for archaeology. I think every ability level can do at least something in this field. So
that is such great advice. Mason, today you have shown us that you can totally do that, and so can others. Thank you for coming on today and sharing your experience. This is your host, Alena Skinner, saying thank you to all of you for your time. Join us for the next podcast. I can totally do that.